All right, Joshua. In previous videos, we gave a little introduction to the book of Joshua, and we said it's a book about how God is going to keep his word, and it leaves us with the question, will Israel keep theirs? We then looked at the first two chapters of Joshua in the next video, and we saw how Israel is going to do this impossible task. It is ultimately God who's going to give them the land, and their responsibility is to trust and obey. And then in chapter 2, we looked at one of the answers to one of the more difficult questions about the book of Joshua. We see all this judgment in Joshua, and we wonder, what will God do for a wicked Gentile who puts their faith in him? And we see that it's mercy. God shows mercy to Rahab and her family. Now we're in chapter 3, and the story's really getting going again as Israel is ready to enter the promised land. They're literally camped on the banks of the Jordan with the promised land only a short distance away. And this is a significant chapter because we're beginning to see how Israel is going to take over the land. God is stooping down to show his people, I will deliver you. And it starts with God clearly leading. You can see in Joshua 3:3, when does Joshua tell the people they were supposed to move? He says, as soon as you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. And the ark of the covenant symbolized God's presence. So at the very beginning here, God is making it clear that he is the one leading them to the land, and he is the one who's going to give them victory in the land. And that's why Joshua's instructions really have nothing to do with military strategy, but instead with the people getting themselves spiritually ready. What does he say in verse 5? Then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And Israel needed God to do wonders among them because the Israelites faced an obstacle entering the land. And ironically, this obstacle is pretty much the same one they faced leaving Egypt. The Jordan River is between them and the promised land. And you'll see the word Jordan is pretty important in the next two chapters. It occurs 10 times in chapters 3, 13 times in chapter 4. And in a sense, the Jordan is seen throughout the book of Deuteronomy as the door to the promised land. And the Israelites are told they will cross over the Jordan to take possession of the promised land. And here it's God who opens the door. Now, normally the Jordan would be a narrow, easily crossable river, but according to scholars, they were crossing at the spring of the year, and this was the time of year when the river was in its flood stage. And in the particular area they were seeking to cross, the waters were turbulent. And you could say from a human perspective that after 40 years in the wilderness, they had come to the Jordan River at basically the worst possible time. As they're about to enter the promised land, they're in a sense standing before a raging river. They're about to face their enemies, people their parents had feared greatly, and their leader Moses had died. How could they know that God would be with them? How could they know that God would be with Joshua? All these difficulties were not an accident. God planned a very specific miracle to bring them encouragement that they could trust him and that they should follow Joshua. What does God say in verse 7 to Joshua? He says, today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. And what reason does Joshua give in verse 10 why God is enabling them to enter the promised land this way? Joshua says, here is how you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, and on and on. What's happening, God is stooping down to part the Jordan River as a way to encourage Israel to believe he will keep his word. They're to know that he is with them, and they are to know that Yahweh goes before them into the promised land. But the crossing of the Jordan would not have only been a lesson to Israel, obviously. It would have said something to the Canaanites as well. Bruce Waltke writes, in Canaanite mythology, Baal was believed to reign as king among the gods because he triumphed over the sea god and the river god. But I am, not Baal, is the true God and Lord over the water, as he was at the Red Sea, at the flood and creation. Additionally, in surviving the crossing of the Jordan, I am demonstrates his rightful claim to the land. In the ancient Near East, a common way for obtaining a judicial verdict was by compelling the accused to submit to being cast into a river. If he drowned, the gods declared him not guilty. If not, the gods declared him innocent. By entering the Jordan first and then standing in the midst of the riverbed, the whole time the nation crosses over, I Am passes the trial by water. The triumph of I Am and of his people in the river crossing proved their claim to the land. No wonder the Canaanite kings are fearful. So you need to obey me, chapter 1. You need to trust me, chapter 2. And I'm going to deliver you, chapter 3. And as I deliver you, you need to make a plan to remember how I did that. That's chapter 4. In chapter 4, God calls on Israel to make a specific plan to remember the way in which he enabled them to cross the Jordan River. What specifically were they supposed to do according to Joshua 4, verse 3? We read, take 12 stones from here out of the middle of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight. Now, why? Verses 5 to 7. Joshua said to them, pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, that this may be a sign among you when your children ask in time to come, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever. God wants his people to remember how he saved them. And in these stories, we see God's absolute control. First of all, nature is no problem for him. He says what he wants to happen, and it happens. Second, and perhaps a little more subtly, in chapter 3, verse 7, God explains what he's doing. He's exalting Joshua. And then in chapter 4, verse 14, he does it. On that day, the Lord exalted Joshua. And then third, they would have to establish a way to remember these events because they weren't going to be God's normal way of working. We catch a glimpse of God's passion for his greatness to be displayed and remembered and enjoyed. After all, why did God have the stones set up the way they were? What does verse 24 tell us? So that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. God is rescuing Israel, and here he's doing it in a dramatic way, and he's providing a way for them to remember so that the whole world would know what kind of God he is. Even though by chapter 5 they've entered the land, God still has more to do to prepare them for war. And the way he chooses to prepare them is very surprising, at least in terms of war strategy. The leaders of those who lived in Canaan heard about what God was doing in Israel, and they were frightened as a result. That's verse 1 of chapter 5. Joshua and the other Israelites don't know that yet. They had heard, of course, how the spies had gone in, and the Canaanites were frightened of them, but still they were going to war, and they must have felt like they were in something of a vulnerable position. And yet in this vulnerable position, God asks them to do something that will make them more vulnerable. He commands Joshua to make flint knives and to circumcise the sons of Israel. And so here Joshua is starting off the conquest by making his strongest men weak. And what's the reason for doing this according to chapter 5, verse 4? This is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the males of the people who came out of Egypt, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt. Though all the people who came out had been circumcised, yet all the people who were born on the way in the wilderness after they had come out of Egypt had not been circumcised, which is pretty significant and sad, because the circumcision was a physical sign of the covenant that God had made with Abraham and his descendants. So before they're going into battle, they are to demonstrate that they are identifying with and taking the responsibilities of the covenant that God had made with their ancestors. And so even as this generation of Israelites receives this external sign that they were part of God's people, we should take note of the warning found in this passage. And that is the fact that in verse 5, that although the people who had come out of Egypt were circumcised, they perished in the wilderness because they did not obey the voice of the Lord. After honoring God by obeying this command regarding circumcision, the people worship God through celebrating the Passover, verses 10 and 11. This reminds them of God's great rescue and that God has a plan for them that he began long ago. However, because they are in the land, what stops, according to verse 12 of chapter 5? The manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land, and there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. Sometimes we think the only way that God provides is when he provides in a miraculous way, like with manna. But of course, the fruit of Canaan was also part of God's provision for his people, even if it involved picking fruit off a tree instead of bread falling from the sky. Dale Ralph Davis explains, he says, in the wilderness, Israel had an extraordinary need, and extraordinary needs often call forth God's unusual supply. But now Israel is in the land, and their food grows in the ground, so it needn't come from heaven. The manna was God's exceptional supply for a special need. But now that that need becomes normal, his provision comes by ordinary means. But it's still his provision, whether it's manna that falls from heaven in the wilderness or grain that grows from the ground in Canaan. After these two stories, the scene suddenly shifts. We're no longer looking at the entire nation of Israel, but instead we find Joshua by himself near Jericho. We're finally coming to the section of Joshua where Israel is going to battle against its enemies. And we should really look at chapter 5, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 5 as a unit. What's happening here is Joshua is meeting with the real general, and he's receiving his marching orders. And there's a shock to this story. Joshua is somewhere near Jericho when suddenly there's a man standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. And if you put yourself in Joshua's shoes, this is a surprising and frightening moment, right? For a man to appear out of nowhere and for him to have a drawn sword, this is a serious scene. And in light of the circumstances, Joshua asks a very obvious question: are you for us or for our adversaries? And the man answers, you remember, no, which is such a fantastic answer. Joshua is asking, are you on our side or are you on their side? But the man is responding by saying, Joshua, that's the wrong question. The question is really, are you on my side? Now, what gives him the right to say something like this? He can say this because he is a commander of the army of the Lord. And Joshua's response shows that he understands that. He falls on his face and he worships. And then he says, what does my Lord say to his servant? And this is Joshua saying, you are my king and I am your servant, not the other way around. And the way Joshua responds indicates this is not a mere angel. That's confirmed in the next sentence when the commander of the Lord's army tells Joshua to do the exact same thing that God told Moses to do around the burning bush. Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Now, the angel of the Lord is a very important figure in the Old Testament. We're meeting him here, and we'll see him again. And he prepares us for Jesus. So Let's take a moment to make sure that we understand who he is by looking at a couple of passages that talk about him. What is the angel of the Lord able to do in Genesis chapter 16, verse 10? Genesis 16, verse 10. The angel of the Lord said to her, to Hagar, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. So he makes promises for God, and he is in control of a woman's womb. Genesis 16:13, what does he know? So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. You are a God who knows. That's what she says to the angel of the Lord. He sees, he knows. Exodus chapter 3, verse 7 speaks of the angel of the Lord, and he here says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. What does the angel of the Lord do in Exodus chapter 23, verse 21? Behold, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I prepared. This is Yahweh speaking to Moses. Pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. To sin against him is to sin against God. What miracles does he do? In Exodus chapter 3, verse 2, the angel of the Lord, he appears to Moses in a flame of fire, and yet the bush is burning, but it's not consumed. Judges chapter 6, verse 21, we see the angel of the Lord again. Judges chapter 6, verse 21. Then the angel of the Lord reached out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened cakes, and fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat of the unleavened cakes, and the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. What does the angel of the Lord receive in Joshua chapter 5, verse 14? Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped and said to him. He spoke to the angel of the Lord. He receives worship. What happens in Revelation 19:10 when John tries to worship a normal angel? Do you remember what the normal angel says to John? Revelation 19:10, he falls flat on his face the way Joshua did. The angel says, you must not do that. I'm a fellow servant with you and your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God. And so who is this angel of the Lord? If he's the one, God's name is in him, if he speaks and makes promises for God, if he performs miracles like God, if he receives worship the way God does. After surveying all the evidence, Walt Kaiser concludes, the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament was a pre-incarnate form of our Lord Jesus Christ, who would later permanently take on flesh when he came as a babe in Bethlehem. But mark it well, the one who came after John had already been before he was that angel of the Lord. His full deity was always observed, and yet he presented the same mystery of the Trinity that would later be observed in I and the Father are one, and my other witness is the Father who sent me. It is that word sent that ties together the angel, messenger, or sent one into an Old Testament theology of Christophanies, appearances of God in human form. It's Jesus then who appeared to Joshua as this great warrior. And in Joshua, we see this great warrior gives Joshua instructions for how he is to battle against Jericho. The city is shut, which makes the situation fairly hopeless for Israel. They hadn't fought this kind of battle before. And yet God says in Joshua 6:2, see, I've given Jericho into your hand. There is no obstacle too big for God. God gives Joshua a plan for defeating Jericho that demonstrates that he, God, is the one winning the battle, and that the way he will deliver his people is not through their might, but through faith and obedience. And once again, as we read through these verses, the Ark of the Covenant is at the center. In this chapter, chapter 6, we'll read, or chapter 5, we'll read the Ark The word ark repeated 10 times, 9 times in verses 6 through 15. And the ark represents the presence of God. Clearly, it's God's presence that matters, not might or military strategy. As he prepares his people in chapters 1 through 5, we see God's plan for victory is very simple. Obey, trust, remember, keep the covenant, and I will keep my promises. That's how he prepares them to enter the land. And in chapters 6 through 12, which we'll look at next time, we see how they actually took the land.